In this video, we're going to approach how to replace the clutch, pressure plate, and pilot bearing on the Honda S2000. Alright, so we're going to jump right into it. In order to completely separate the transmission and get to the clutch, we have to unbolt the starter, which is located on the driver's side under the intake manifold. So to start, release the 5 retainer clips for the air filter box. Then loosen the intake hose clamp at the throttle body with a 10mm. Remove the smaller hose and hose clamps and pull the intake away from the throttle body. Next, loosen the 3 10mm bolts to remove the lower intake airbox. This vacuum solenoid is held on by one Phillip or star screw. Next, we're going to remove the battery cables because we'll be working on the starter. Negative first, then positive. Now with a 14mm socket and ratchet, we will loosen the tension on the serpentine belt and remove it from the alternator pulley, since we will need to remove the alternator to get to the starter. The alternator has 2 15mm bolts securing it to the engine. And unfortunately, I didn't show how to unplug the wires to the alternator, but it's pretty self-explanatory. With the alternator out, we can now use a 3/8 ratchet with some long extensions and a swivel 14mm socket to remove the 2 starter bolts that go to the transmission. Alright. When I was researching how to replace the clutch on the S2000, I saw a lot of people removing the exhaust manifold to gain access to the transmission bolts. I plan to do the same. Here I'm removing the heat shield mounted to the unibody. There's 3 10mm bolts that hold it. And they were pretty hard to reach. The last bolt had to be reached from under the car. So I begin to remove the 14mm exhaust manifold heat shield bolts, so I could remove the manifold bolts themselves, but they were rusted. The heat shield bolts would be difficult to deal with, so I realized I should just leave the manifold on to prevent breaking any bolts. So we go to the interior. For the transmission to come out, we need to remove the shift lever and the knob. The shift bezel pops out easily. Watch out for any wires plugged into the bezel. Now carefully remove the shift lever boot with a hose pick. This plastic retainer ring is pretty brittle. Remove the rubber hole boot. Now remove the 3 10mm bolts under the rubber to remove the shift lever. I slow this video down just so you can see exactly where my socket's going, because there's another set of bolts, but it's not the outer ones, it's the inner one closest to the shift lever. And you should end up looking like this with the spring in there. You can either take it out or leave it in. Just don't lose that spring. Now, under the vehicle, starting on the passenger side of the engine, remove this 17mm transmission bolt. Now, right above this bolt is another 17 that is difficult to reach with exhaust manifold mounted. I remove it with a universal socket and extension. Next, remove the 2 14mm transmission bolts at the bottom of the transmission, or the bell housing. Be sure to stay organized because the bolts, they can't be rearranged or mixed around. You have to put them back where they came from, just because there's different sizes and lengths. My tool got stuck while I was taking it out, so it's pretty tight in there. Next, let's remove the clutch slave cylinder. There's two 12mm bolts holding this on. And once you get those undone, remove the dust boot. Now the clutch fork comes out when you separate the transmission from the engine. Next, let's begin disconnecting the transmission harness connectors that are on the driver's side. Be careful, as the connectors can be stuck and pretty brittle. Try to press the tab and then use a flathead screwdriver to separate them, or to pry the connector loose. Next, begin removing the drive shaft bolts. There are 6 in total, and there are size 6 of the Allen key. Be careful not to strip them. I had to use an extension for clearance issues with the ratchet head. Remove the 12mm bolts on the drive shaft strap so you can lower the drive shaft. Next, carefully remove the transmission mount bolts. There's 4 14mm bolts. Make sure the trans is supported so it doesn't fall on you. Also, make sure you unbolt the exhaust manifold from the rest of the exhaust. This allows the engine to tilt downward. See, when I move the engine, it's free. Now, remove the hard to reach 17mm transmission bolts from the top of the driver's side of the bell housing with an extension and a swivel socket. Next is the impossible bolt. It is too close to the firewall. This requires the engine's subframe to be lowered a couple inches in order to remove this bolt. As you can see, the head is just way too close to the firewall. There's no space. Now begin loosening these 19mm subframe bolts. I remove one to show you how long it is. These 2 long ones stay in and allow the subframe to be lowered. The others are pretty short, so be careful. Some people purchase longer bolts to use temporarily in place of the short ones, but I just carefully left them in. You can see the short one only gives about an inch of clearance or a drop of the subframe. With the subframe bolts loosened, but still threaded in, we now have clearance to remove that top transmission bolt. Again, I'm using a couple long extensions with a swivel socket to remove this difficult bolt from behind the transmission down the tunnel. Showing what the setup looks like, reaching from the back of the transmission. The position helped most to be able to break the transmission bolts loose since they're very tight. Now, remove the shift fork by pulling away from the throwout bearing. It will become loose, just leave it there. It only comes out when the transmission is actually pulled away from the engine. And at this point, you can now pry the transmission apart from the engine's dowel pins. I wasn't able to get that part on camera, but just be careful and make sure you have your jack under the transmission when removing it. So I kept the transmission supported on my 1.5 ton jack, pulled back enough to get the clutch out. I didn't remove the transmission all the way out. Using a 12-point shallow 10mm socket, I began removing the pressure plate bolts. To keep the engine from rotating, I put a transmission bolt in the engine and use it as an anchor point with my pry bar against the engine's flywheel teeth. You can also rotate the engine this way. And now, safely remove the clutch and pressure plate assembly from the flywheel's dowel pins. That clutch was worn. And this is the pressure plate side of the clutch disc. It was worn, destroyed. The symptom it caused was while driving was known as clutch slip. When you accelerated aggressively, the clutch would slip and made the car feel like it lost power or didn't have enough on takeoff. The pressure plate shows wear. Flywheel shows signs of wear as well. However, the owner did not want to get the flywheel resurfaced, even though it's required for every clutch replacement. Pay attention to the flywheel, make sure you don't see any big cracks. If there are, take it to a reputable place to get resurfaced, or just buy a new or a good condition used one. Ours looked okay. Now you do need to replace the flywheel's pilot bearing, so the flywheel needs to be removed from the engine. The 17mm flywheel bolts are shallow and require a 12-point socket. Be careful not to strip them during removal. They are extremely tight. I will use a transmission bolt again for an anchor point and wedge a socket in between the bolt and flywheel. This allows me to use both hands when dealing with the flywheel bolts. With the flywheel removed, tap out the pilot bearing towards the back of the flywheel. The bearing can only go one way, and that's through the back side of the flywheel, or the side that mates to the engine's crankshaft. Pilot bearing should be pressed in, but we are improvising with limited tools in a backyard. Without damaging the pilot bearing, tap it into place, and make sure it's fully seated into the flywheel. Just showing what the pilot bearing looks like. Almost all the way in, but we had to make it a little bit more flush. There you go. So see what the pilot bearing looks like fully seated into the flywheel now. There you go. Now make sure you use a torque wrench when reinstalling the flywheel. The Honda S2000's F-Series engine flywheel bolts torque spec is 94 foot-pounds. So here I'm setting my torque wrench to 94 foot-pounds. Hard to see, this GoPro doesn't zoom. Also, make sure you torque the bolts in a star pattern to make sure the flywheel is flat against the engine's crankshaft. Next, check the transmission's input shaft for any excessive wear or damage. Also, check the throwout bearing rides along this bushing around the input shaft. You can apply some of the grease onto the shaft and throwout bearings bushing for smooth installation and operation. Use the grease pack that came with the new clutch kit. This is the throwout bearing, and it goes like this. This is the clutch disc, and it goes like this. And this is how you install the assembly to the flywheel. Carefully line the pressure plate to the flywheel's dowel pins and rotate the clutch assembly to line those dowel pin holes to the pressure plate's holes. Once you got them lined up, begin installing those 12.10mm pressure plate bolts. And just hand tighten them. Then install the clutch alignment tool that comes with the new clutch kit. To make sure the clutch disc is as close to center as possible. This makes installing the transmission smoother and that the clutch operates correctly and doesn't wear out prematurely. You can see the tool moves the clutch disc because the pressure plate bolts are still loose. Tighten the pressure plate bolts once you're comfortable with the clutch alignment. You can rotate the engine to reach the other bolts. The pressure plate bolt torque spec is 19 foot-pounds. Clean and inspect the clutch fork. Apply some of the supplied grease. To these points that you see me put on. Now I'm showing how the clutch fork is installed when the transmission is mated to the engine. Leave the fork loose though in the hull while you're installing the transmission, because you're going to need to line those forks, the shift forks ears behind the throwout bearing. Alright, now start getting ready to move that transmission closer to the engine safely. And then start lining up the shift fork with the transmission once the transmission is close enough. And start hand threading the transmission's bell housing bolts just to hold it in place and begin to close the transmission. Make sure the engine and transmission dowel pins are lined up. Then you can start tightening the bolts. If the bolts become tight, but you still have a gap between the transmission and engine, loosen the bolts and check the dowel pins and make sure they go in properly. Or if something like a harness is pinched in between the engine and transmission. And now I'm going to show you how I was reinstalling those hard to reach transmission bolts on top. Reinstalling dust boot and slave cylinder. Slave cylinder bolt torch spec is 16 foot-pounds. Once the transmission is tight, raise it to start bolting in the transmission's mount, and then the drive shaft. Here I'm using a piece of plastic from the new clutch box to hold a starter bolt in the socket that I'm using with an extension. Installing the starter bolts were very difficult. Like I said, because it's so far under the engine's intake manifold, and you're gonna have to end up using a swivel for one of the sockets, but right here I'm just going straight with a shallow 14. And that's pretty much it. Once you get those starter bolts tight, you can reinstall your intake and your belt, your alternator, just like I showed in the beginning of removal. And then once we finish tightening everything back up, lower the car and get ready to take it for a test drive. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. And make sure to share it with any friends that like cars, or people who like to do their own repairs. Also, if you're wanting to improve the car's performance, you could also go with the lightened flywheel with an upgraded pressure plate and a more aggressive friction disc. Usually clutch kits come as kits, but you can get an upgraded version of all that. There's many stages and name brands that offer it. Just look and do some research, because I don't know what name brand is better than the other for the particular car that we did this clutch on. Again, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and look forward to posting more videos for the year of 2023. It's been a long time since I posted, but I'm hoping to keep up with the pace this year. Gonna try to get some more videos edited and show more car repair. All right, take care.